The origins of the Fokker Eindecker can only be understood within the context of the desperate search for air superiority during the opening years of the First World War. When the conflict began in 1914, aircraft were still regarded largely as tools for reconnaissance. Machines crisscrossed the front lines at low altitude, photographing trenches and directing artillery fire, but they lacked standardized weapons and effective combat doctrine. Pilots sometimes carried pistols or rifles, but these were largely symbolic. Air combat consisted of fleeting encounters and occasional daring stunts rather than systematic strategy. Both sides recognized that whichever nation developed a reliable armed fighter would control the skies and thereby shape the battlefields below. It was within this environment that Anthony Fokker, a Dutch-born aviation entrepreneur working in Germany, introduced a technical innovation that would transform air combat. He had already established his reputation in pre-war aviation circles by founding Fokker Aeroplanbau in Germany and producing early monoplanes. When war broke out, his factory was well positioned to serve the German military, though initially the aircraft he provided were unarmed scouts. The challenge lay not in mounting weapons, but in synchronizing them so that a machine gun could fire through the propeller arc without striking the blades. The synchronization problem was not new. Inventors in several nations had been experimenting with various interrupter gears, but most designs were either unreliable or prone to catastrophic accidents. French aviator Roland Garros had managed to mount deflector plates on his propeller blades, but this solution was inefficient and dangerous, often damaging the aircraft itself. German engineers sought something more precise, and it was Fokker's team that produced the breakthrough. By designing a cam-driven interrupter gear that allowed a machine gun to fire only when the propeller blades were clear, they solved the problem in a way that was both effective and reproducible. The airframe chosen to carry this new weapon was the Fokker M5, a simple, shoulder-wing monoplane inspired by contemporary French designs. Lightweight, agile, and relatively easy to build, it provided a suitable platform for the synchronized Spandau machine gun. Rebranded as the Fokker Eindecker, literally monoplane, it became the first aircraft in history to combine maneuverability with a reliable forward-firing weapon. With this innovation, air combat was no longer a matter of chance encounters. For the first time, a pilot could aim his entire aircraft like a rifle and bring sustained firepower to bear directly in line with his flight path. The Eindecker's introduction in mid-1915 marked the beginning of what Allied pilots would later call the Fokker Scourge. British and French crews, flying largely unarmed or poorly armed biplanes, suddenly faced a German machine capable of dictating terms in the sky. The Eindecker was not fast by later standards, nor was it especially robust, but its revolutionary armament gave it an unprecedented tactical advantage. German pilots such as Max Immelmann and Oswald Boelke used the new fighter to devastating effect, pioneering aerial maneuvers and combat tactics that would shape air warfare for decades. The aircraft was thus not merely a new tool, it was the birth of the fighter as a distinct and decisive class of weapon. Development of the Eindecker also highlighted the rapid pace of wartime innovation. Within months of its deployment, both sides were rushing to replicate or counter its advantages. Engineers in France and Britain scrambled to produce their own interrupter gears and new fighter designs. By 1916, the advantage the Eindecker had created was already eroding, but its impact had been felt across every front. The short-lived dominance of this aircraft underscored how quickly technological superiority could shift, and how air power was becoming central to modern warfare. In essence, the Fokker Eindecker was not remarkable for its airframe or performance alone, but for the way it combined existing elements into a coherent fighting system. Its interrupter gear, integrated with a serviceable monoplane, gave Germany a temporary but decisive edge in aerial warfare. It demonstrated conclusively that control of the air would be a contested and decisive factor in 20th century battles. While later fighters would quickly surpass it, the Eindecker occupies a singular place in history as the first true fighter aircraft, the machine that changed air combat from improvisation into doctrine. Prototype development of the Fokker Eindecker reflected both the urgency of wartime needs and the limitations of early aviation technology. The basic airframe chosen for adaptation, the Fokker M5, was a derivative of the French Morane-Saulnier Type H. It featured a slender fuselage of welded steel tubing covered in fabric, a shoulder-mounted wing, and a simple tailplane. Its construction was straightforward, making it easy to manufacture and maintain in frontline conditions. The aircraft was not designed to be a revolutionary machine on its own. Instead, its true importance came from the integration of the synchronized machine gun. The key engineering challenge was to transform Garros's crude deflector plate solution into a reliable synchronization mechanism. Fokker's team, working at high speed in the spring of 1915, experimented with mechanical linkages that connected the machine gun's trigger to the rotation of the propeller shaft. After several iterations, they settled on a cam-operated gear that interrupted the gun's firing whenever a propeller blade crossed the line of fire. Early trials were conducted under strict secrecy, with test flights at Dobritz Airfield revealing both the potential and the hazards of the system. Malfunctions could jam the gun or cause dangerous misfires, but with careful refinement, the device was brought to a level of reliability acceptable for combat. The first test flights of the armed M5 prototype demonstrated a new kind of air power. Pilots found that the ability to point the aircraft and fire straight ahead dramatically simplified air combat. Rather than relying on awkward angles or handheld weapons, they could now pursue an enemy aircraft, align their flight path, and unleash sustained bursts of fire. Reports from these initial tests convinced German authorities that the concept was viable, and orders were placed for production. Transitioning from prototype to frontline-ready fighter required further adjustments. The mounting of the Spandau machine gun had to account for vibration, heat, and accessibility for reloading and clearing jams. The airframe itself was slightly strengthened to cope with the added weight and stresses of combat maneuvering. Early production variants, designated EI, entered service in mid-1915 equipped with a single synchronized gun. Later versions, such as the E2 and E3, incorporated more powerful engines, minor structural refinements, and in some cases, a second gun. Each iteration sought to extend the Eindecker's advantage as Allied countermeasures began to appear. Flight trials also revealed limitations that were not initially apparent. The Eindecker was stable in level flight, but relatively sluggish in turning compared to contemporary biplanes. Its climb rate was modest, and its structure was vulnerable to battle damage. Yet despite these shortcomings, the synchronization gear gave it an overwhelming edge in actual combat situations. This was not lost on German pilots, who quickly adapted their tactics to exploit the aircraft's unique strengths. The transition from unarmed reconnaissance to armed fighter patrols was a turning point for the Luftstreitkräfte, the Imperial German Air Service. With the Eindecker ready for operational deployment, Germany was about to establish temporary but decisive air superiority. The stage was set for the machine to demonstrate its effectiveness not merely as a prototype but as the instrument of a new form of warfare, organized offensive air combat. The entry of the Fokker Eindecker into active service in mid-1915 signaled a dramatic change in the balance of power in the skies. Assigned first to individual pilots attached to reconnaissance units, the aircraft's potential was quickly recognized, and small detachments of Eindeckers were formed specifically for fighter duties. These were not yet formalized squadrons, but their presence immediately influenced air operations. For the first time, German aviators could fly patrols with the explicit mission of hunting enemy aircraft rather than simply escorting or observing. The impact on Allied forces was profound. British and French aviators, accustomed to flying largely unarmed or inadequately armed biplanes, found themselves outmatched. The synchronized machine gun of the Eindecker allowed German pilots to dictate engagements, attacking from superior positions and maintaining fire directly in line with their aircraft's path. Reconnaissance missions over German-held territory became increasingly hazardous, and casualty rates among Allied crews rose sharply. Newspapers and military communiques from the period frequently referred to this sudden German dominance as the Fokker Scourge. German aces such as Max Immelmann and Oswald Bielke became the first true fighter pilots of the war, using the Eindecker to establish reputations that would make them household names. Immelmann, in particular, developed maneuvers that maximized the aircraft's strengths, including what would later be known as the Immelmann turn, a climbing reversal that allowed a pilot to quickly change direction and re-engage an opponent. Bielke, meanwhile, was not only an accomplished combat pilot, but also a tactician, documenting principles of air combat that would evolve into formal doctrine. Their successes demonstrated the Eindecker's potential as more than a technological curiosity. It was a practical and deadly weapon of war. Reactions from the Allied side varied between alarm and determination. Initial reports often exaggerated the Eindecker's capabilities, describing it as vastly superior to anything the Allies possessed. In reality, while the interrupter gear gave it a decisive advantage, the aircraft's performance was not significantly better than many contemporary machines. Its real strength lay in its integration of weapon and airframe, which allowed German pilots to fight with unprecedented effectiveness. Nonetheless, Allied morale suffered as crews struggled against an enemy that seemed to hold all the cards in the air. The German command structure quickly recognized the value of concentrating Eindeckers rather than dispersing them among reconnaissance units. This led to the creation of specialized fighter formations that would evolve into Jagdstaffeln, dedicated fighter squadrons. These early organizational changes laid the foundation for modern Air Force structures, where control of the skies became a distinct and vital component of overall strategy. By late 1915, the presence of Eindeckers had forced Allied planners to reconsider their aerial operations. Large, heavily escorted formations began to replace isolated reconnaissance flights, and research into synchronization mechanisms accelerated in both France and Britain. The temporary supremacy enjoyed by the Eindecker thus spurred rapid technological development on both sides, fueling the arms race in the skies. In its first months of service, the Fokker Eindecker not only gave Germany local air superiority, but also altered the way air power was perceived. No longer an auxiliary to ground forces, aircraft were now recognized as weapons capable of directly influencing the course of the war. The Eindecker's operational debut marked the beginning of fighter aviation as an essential military arm, and its impact on strategy and morale was immediate and undeniable. The combat record of the Fokker Eindecker was defined less by overwhelming numbers than by the outsized influence it exerted on the battlefield. By the autumn of 1915, German pilots flying the type had established air dominance along critical stretches of the Western Front. Their main missions included intercepting Allied reconnaissance flights, attacking artillery spotters, and disrupting bombing raids. In these roles, the Eindecker proved deadly. A single well-placed burst from its synchronized Spandau machine gun could bring down fragile Allied biplanes, which often had little defensive armament or protection. Aces such as Immelmann and Boelke exemplified how the aircraft could be used to maximum effect. They patrolled aggressively, striking quickly and decisively before climbing away to safety. Their combat reports indicated how much the Eindecker had changed tactics. Engagements shifted from brief exchanges of rifle fire to deliberate, coordinated duels in which positioning and timing mattered as much as raw flying skill. German crews began to fly in pairs or small groups, ensuring mutual support and creating the first seeds of team-based fighter tactics. Despite its successes, the Eindecker also revealed its shortcomings in combat. Its wing warping control system made it less responsive than later aircraft equipped with ailerons. While adequate for steady flight, the system imposed limits on maneuverability, particularly in tight dogfights. The aircraft's climb rate and top speed were only modest, and its light structure made it vulnerable to return fire. For all its innovation, it was still a transitional design, and its strength lay almost entirely in its armament advantage rather than its airframe. Setbacks inevitably followed as Allied forces adapted. By early 1916, new Allied fighters began to enter service, including the British Airco DH-2 and the French Nieuport 11, both of which incorporated synchronization systems or alternative designs that could mount forward-firing guns. These machines, more agile and often faster, began to neutralize the Eindecker's edge. Encounters became more evenly matched, and the aura of invincibility that surrounded the German fighter started to diminish. German pilots themselves were quick to note the aircraft's limitations. Immelmann was killed in June 1916 under circumstances that remain debated, possibly due to structural failure of his aircraft or malfunction of the synchronization gear. His loss was a blow to German morale and underscored the dangers of relying on a machine that was already becoming outdated. By mid-1916, Boelke and other experienced pilots were urging the adoption of newer designs that could restore German superiority in the air. Tactically, however, the Eindecker had already left its mark. The experiences of flying it led to the formalization of air combat principles. Boelke codified these into the famous Dicta Boelke, which outlined fundamental rules of engagement such as maintaining altitude advantage, attacking from the sun, and ensuring mutual support between pilots. These principles would outlast the Eindecker itself and remain relevant throughout the evolution of fighter aviation. In summary, the combat use of the Fokker Eindecker demonstrated the decisive impact of marrying effective weaponry to an aircraft platform. While its dominance was short-lived, it established the concept of fighter patrols, aerial tactics, and ace pilots as central to modern warfare. Even as more advanced Allied designs emerged to challenge it, the Eindecker had already reshaped the battlefield and forced every combatant nation to prioritize fighter development. Its influence in this phase of the war was not measured solely in victories, but in the transformation of air combat into a distinct and critical domain of military operations. The Fokker Eindecker underwent several iterations during its brief but influential service life, each reflecting attempts to extend its combat effectiveness in the face of rapidly advancing Allied aviation technology. The first production version, the EI, was essentially an armed adaptation of the M5 airframe, fitted with an 80-horsepower Oberursel U.0 rotary engine, itself a near copy of the French Gnome Lambda. This initial model was relatively underpowered, but it introduced the synchronized Spandau LMG-08 machine gun that made the design revolutionary. The E2 followed, featuring a slightly more powerful Oberursel UI rotary engine delivering 100 horsepower. This allowed for improved performance in climb and level speed, although the aircraft still lagged behind contemporary Allied scouts in maneuverability. The fuselage was widened slightly to accommodate the larger power plant, and other structural reinforcements were added to cope with combat stresses. The E2 also standardized the gun mount, ensuring greater reliability and making it easier for pilots to clear jams during battle. The most numerous variant, the E3, became the definitive Eindecker. Produced in larger numbers than its predecessors, it included refinements in engine performance and a strengthened airframe, though its general configuration remained unchanged. Many E3s were fitted with a single machine gun, but some were equipped with two, providing greater firepower at the cost of added weight and reduced agility. This version dominated the skies during the height of the so-called Fokker Scourge in late 1915 and early 1916. Later versions, such as the EIV, attempted to further increase combat effectiveness by introducing the more powerful 160-horsepower Oberursel U3 rotary engine and arming the aircraft with up to 3 synchronized machine guns. However, this variant highlighted the limitations of the basic design. The heavier engine and additional guns made the aircraft difficult to handle, reducing maneuverability and causing serious mechanical reliability issues. Few EIVs saw combat, and they were quickly overshadowed by new biplane fighters that rendered the Eindecker obsolete. Technologically, the Eindecker series illustrated both the potential and the constraints of early fighter development. The airframe was essentially that of a pre-war sporting monoplane, adapted for combat through incremental improvements. Its reliance on wing warping for lateral control placed it at a disadvantage against aircraft with more advanced control surfaces, and its lightly built structure limited the amount of modification it could sustain. Yet the very fact that it could be iteratively improved through stronger engines, additional armament, and structural reinforcements demonstrates how adaptable even a simple design could be under wartime pressures. Internationally, the Eindecker design did not see widespread licensed production, as its value lay primarily in the synchronization gear rather than the airframe itself. Other nations quickly developed their own interrupter systems, and the rapid obsolescence of the Eindecker discouraged attempts to copy it wholesale. Instead, its technological legacy was absorbed into new designs across Europe, where engineers sought to build faster, more maneuverable aircraft that incorporated synchronized forward-firing guns as a standard feature. Thus, while the Fokker Eindecker's variants remained relatively limited, the evolutionary steps from EI to EIV reflected both the urgency of maintaining air superiority and the short technological lifespans characteristic of First World War aircraft. Each model represented an attempt to extend the life of a design that was already being outpaced by developments elsewhere. In this way, the Eindecker served not only as the first true fighter, but also as an object lesson in the relentless pace of aeronautical innovation under combat conditions. The global impact and legacy of the Fokker Eindecker cannot be measured solely in terms of its production numbers or combat victories. Its most enduring contribution lay in the way it redefined air power during the First World War. By proving the effectiveness of a synchronized, forward-firing machine gun mounted on a dedicated fighter platform, the Eindecker established the template for all subsequent combat aircraft. From the moment of its introduction in 1915, no serious air force could ignore the necessity of equipping fighters with fixed, forward-firing armament. This became a universal standard, influencing design and doctrine for decades. The Eindecker also accelerated the professionalization of military aviation. Before its arrival, many pilots still viewed themselves as observers or scouts, supporting ground troops by reporting movements or spotting artillery. The Eindecker transformed these pilots into combatants with direct offensive roles. It created the environment in which the first generation of aces emerged, with names like Boelke and Immelmann achieving iconic status. These individuals were not merely celebrated for personal valor. They became symbols of a new form of warfare where dominance in the air could decide outcomes on the ground. This cultural phenomenon spread quickly, with every nation involved in the war elevating their top aviators into figures of national importance. Strategically, the temporary air superiority that the Eindecker granted Germany forced the Allies to divert resources and accelerate innovation. Within months of facing the Fokker Scourge, both France and Britain invested heavily in new designs, leading to the rapid introduction of aircraft such as the Nieuport 11 and the Airco DH-2. In this sense, the Eindecker acted as a catalyst, triggering an arms race in the air that paralleled the industrial-scale competition already unfolding on the ground. This dynamic, the continuous cycle of advantage and counter-advantage in aircraft design, became a defining feature of aerial warfare throughout the 20th century. The aircraft's influence extended into organizational reforms as well. The German Air Service recognized that simply deploying fighters in small numbers was not enough. They needed to be grouped into dedicated units capable of concentrating air power where it mattered most. This realization directly led to the formation of Jagdstaffeln, the specialized fighter squadrons that would dominate the air war later in the conflict. Without the experience of the Eindecker, such doctrinal advances might have been delayed. As the war progressed and the Eindecker was replaced by more advanced designs, its historical significance remained. Museums, historians, and aviation enthusiasts continue to view it as the first true fighter aircraft, the moment when air combat matured from improvisation to systematized doctrine. Replicas and surviving examples are preserved not just as artifacts of technology, but as milestones in the broader story of military innovation. Culturally, the Eindecker endures in the narrative of aviation as a turning point, when human ingenuity found a way to transform the fragile biplanes and monoplanes of early flight into instruments of strategic consequence. Its synchronization gear was the practical solution to a problem that had occupied inventors for years, and its operational success proved that such technical challenges could be overcome in time to affect the outcome of a global conflict. The Fokker Eindecker's legacy is therefore not confined to its own performance, but extends to everything it inspired. It demonstrated the value of fighter aviation, influenced generations of aircraft designers, and forced military leaders to rethink the nature of modern warfare. Though quickly surpassed by more capable machines, its place in history is secure as the aircraft that made aerial combat a decisive factor in 20th century battles. Beyond its celebrated role during the Fokker Scourge, the Eindecker also left behind a series of lesser-known chapters that further illustrate its importance in the rapid evolution of air warfare. Not all of its deployments were widely reported or remembered, and some uses reveal the improvisational character of early aviation at the front. A small number of Eindeckers, for example, were adapted for training purposes once newer fighters replaced them in frontline units. Their relatively simple construction and forgiving handling characteristics at low speeds made them suitable for preparing novice pilots for the transition to combat aircraft, even if by 1917 they were entirely obsolete for active duty. There were also experiments in modifying the airframe for reconnaissance roles after its fighting edge had dulled. Some Eindeckers carried small cameras or attempted limited artillery spotting missions, though the narrow fuselage and limited payload made them poorly suited for such tasks. These experiments underscore how rapidly the pace of technological change could turn a cutting-edge weapon into an airframe useful only for secondary duties. Technical records also hint at the frustrations engineers faced when trying to extend the Eindecker's service life. The EIV variant, intended to carry a heavier engine and multiple guns, proved unwieldy and unreliable. Attempts to improve climb rate and firepower only emphasized the limits of the basic design. Some proposals were floated for even more radical modifications, including structural changes to the wing configuration, but none entered meaningful production. In many ways, the Eindecker's abrupt obsolescence was as instructive as its brief success. It demonstrated to aircraft designers that revolutionary advances could have incredibly short lifespans under wartime conditions. Pilot accounts also offer insights into forgotten aspects of its service. Some memoirs describe the constant attention required to manage the synchronization gear in combat, with stoppages and jams occurring at the worst possible times. Ground crews, too, recalled the delicate calibration needed to keep the firing mechanism safe and effective. These details, rarely included in official reports, highlight the technical fragility of the system that made the Eindecker famous. While it gave pilots an unmatched advantage, it also demanded meticulous upkeep and constant vigilance. In terms of influence beyond Germany, Allied intelligence closely examined captured examples of the Eindecker. British and French engineers studied its interrupter gear with urgency, leading to their own rapid development of synchronization systems. The fact that entire research programs were accelerated in response to this one machine illustrates its broader ripple effect across the aviation world. Finally, the legacy of the Eindecker lives on in the codification of aerial combat rules that grew out of its era. Boelke's dicta, formulated during his time flying the Eindecker, became the foundation for fighter tactics worldwide. While the aircraft itself faded quickly from frontline service, the doctrine it inspired endured for generations, shaping the training and thinking of pilots well into the jet age. In these lesser-known dimensions, training duty, technical experimentation, and the invisible labor of maintenance crews, the story of the Fokker Eindecker is completed. It was not just the fighter that transformed air combat for a brief window in 1915-16, but also a machine whose shortcomings, adaptations, and studied failures propelled aviation toward more robust designs. Its unseen chapters remind us that the history of flight is written not only in victories but also in the experiments and lessons learned along the way. The decline of the Fokker Eindecker was as swift as its rise, illustrating the unforgiving pace of technological change in wartime aviation. By early 1916, Allied manufacturers had fielded new designs that neutralized the Eindecker's once formidable edge. The French Nieuport 11. Bébé, with its lightweight, superior maneuverability, and a top-mounted Lewis gun firing over the propeller arc, quickly eroded German dominance. Likewise, the British Airco DH-2, a pusher biplane with an unobstructed forward-firing gun, allowed Allied pilots to meet the Eindecker on more even terms. Both types proved faster, more agile, and better climbers, rendering the monoplane increasingly vulnerable in head-to-head combat. Operational reports from the front reflected this shift. German pilots who had once enjoyed the initiative in battle now found themselves forced onto the defensive. The Eindecker's limited power, modest structural strength, and reliance on wing warping for lateral control left it ill-equipped to compete with the new generation of Allied scouts. Even elite pilots such as Oswald Boelke began to acknowledge its inadequacies, calling for better machines to preserve Germany's aerial superiority. The emergence of Allied fighter squadrons, fielding more advanced aircraft in organized formations, accelerated the Eindecker's slide into obsolescence. The Luftstreitkräfte responded by phasing out the Eindecker in favor of newer biplane fighters such as the Albatros DI and D2. These aircraft incorporated more powerful engines, twin synchronized guns, and sturdier structures capable of sustaining the stresses of aggressive maneuvering. The lessons learned from the Eindecker, particularly in integrating armament and developing fighter tactics, were directly applied to these successors, ensuring that Germany remained competitive in the escalating aerial arms race. Despite its obsolescence, the Eindecker lingered in secondary roles. Some airframes were relegated to home defense duties against Allied bombers, while others were sent to flight schools to train the next generation of fighter pilots. In these roles, the aircraft continued to provide useful service, but its days as a frontline weapon were clearly over by mid-1916. The loss of air superiority during this transitional period underscored how vital continual innovation had become to the conduct of the war. By the time of the Battle of the Somme in the summer of 1916, the Fokker Scourge was effectively a memory. Allied aircraft and tactics had caught up and surpassed the Eindecker, restoring balance to the skies. Yet even as its combat record dwindled, the Eindecker remained a symbol. For the Allies, it was remembered as the aircraft that had once terrorized their crews. For the Germans, it was remembered as the machine that had first proven the value of fighters in controlling the air. The abrupt obsolescence of the Eindecker also offered a cautionary tale to designers and commanders alike. No single breakthrough could guarantee lasting dominance. Air warfare had become an arena of relentless competition, where advantage was measured in months, not years. The Eindecker had sparked this realization, and in doing so, it set the tempo for the technological race that would define aviation throughout the remainder of the First World War. In the end, the Eindecker's decline did not diminish its historical stature. Rather, it highlighted its role as a transitional aircraft, a bridge between the improvisational air combat of 1914 and the systematic, doctrine-driven fighter warfare of 1917 and beyond. Its legacy endured not in the number of surviving airframes or continued frontline service, but in the strategic lessons it imparted about innovation, adaptation, and the fleeting nature of technological supremacy. The global legacy of the Fokker Eindecker extends far beyond its brief service life on the Western Front. As the first aircraft to successfully integrate a forward-firing synchronized machine gun, it provided a blueprint that was rapidly adopted worldwide. Engineers in France, Britain, and later the United States studied captured examples with urgency, leading to their own synchronization systems and aircraft designed specifically as fighters rather than scouts. In this sense, the Eindecker did not merely influence German aviation, it shaped the course of fighter development across all combatant nations. Its cultural impact was equally significant. For Germany, the Eindecker era marked the rise of the fighter ace as a national hero. Pilots like Max Immelmann and Oswald Boelke became household names, celebrated in newspapers and propaganda as symbols of modern warfare and technological superiority. Their reputations helped to elevate the prestige of aviation in the public imagination, transforming pilots from obscure reconnaissance officers into figures of international fame. The very idea of the ace as a celebrated warrior traces much of its origin to this period. Strategically, the Eindecker changed how military leaders viewed air power. Its short-lived dominance demonstrated that air superiority could no longer be considered optional. It was essential to battlefield success. Reconnaissance and artillery spotting, once seen as the primary missions of aircraft, were only possible when enemy fighters could be countered. The Eindecker proved that without control of the skies, ground forces suffered increased casualties and reduced effectiveness. This realization permanently embedded fighter aircraft into military doctrine and planning. In technological terms, the Eindecker was soon obsolete, but its influence persisted through the principles it introduced. Synchronization gears became standard equipment, and every major aircraft manufacturer began designing machines with forward-firing guns as a baseline feature. Later German aircraft such as the Albatros and Fokker D-series directly descended from the Eindecker's conceptual breakthrough, while Allied counterparts like the Sopwith Pup and Nieuport 17 mirrored the same logic of arming lightweight, maneuverable aircraft for dogfighting. Today, only a handful of original Eindeckers survive, preserved in museums or represented by replicas built for educational and historical purposes. These fragile machines, constructed of steel tubing, fabric, and wood, remind modern audiences how rudimentary the early fighter truly was. Yet their significance outweighs their modest appearance. The Eindecker occupies a place in history not because of its performance statistics, but because of the fundamental shift it initiated in the conduct of war. The Fokker Scourge was brief, lasting less than a year, but its consequences were enduring. It compelled all nations to prioritize aviation research, pushed forward the development of fighter tactics, and inaugurated the tradition of aerial dueling that would continue through both world wars. Its synchronization gear stands as one of the most important technical innovations in aviation history, transforming fragile reconnaissance machines into dedicated weapons of combat. In sum, the Eindecker was the fighter that changed air combat forever. Though quickly surpassed, it forced the world's militaries to recognize the decisive importance of controlling the skies. Its contribution was not measured in longevity, but in the precedent it set, that wars of the modern era would be fought not only on land and sea, but in the air. The story of the Fokker Eindecker ultimately represents a watershed in the history of aviation, one that bridged the gap between improvised aerial skirmishes and organized, doctrine-driven air warfare. Before its arrival, pilots operated without clear tactical frameworks, often improvising in the sky with little more than pistols or carbines. After the Eindecker, the fighter aircraft became an essential component of military planning, reshaping how nations fought and thought about war in 3 dimensions. Its introduction highlighted how quickly technological change could alter the balance of power. In 1915, the Eindecker transformed German pilots into feared opponents, dominating Allied reconnaissance and disrupting artillery spotting with ruthless efficiency. Yet within a year, the aircraft itself was overtaken by Allied designs, a reminder that innovation in wartime is both fleeting and relentless. This cycle of advantage and obsolescence became a defining feature of 20th century aviation, establishing the constant arms race in the air that would persist from the First World War through the Cold War and beyond. The Eindecker's influence was also institutional. The German air service recognized during its brief supremacy that fighters had to be concentrated into dedicated units rather than dispersed piecemeal. This led to the creation of Jagdstaffeln, formations that could impose localized air superiority. From this organizational change grew the modern structure of air forces worldwide, in which fighter squadrons remain a core element of air defense and offensive capability. Even its limitations proved instructive. The difficulties with wing warping control, the fragility of its lightweight frame, and the unreliability of early synchronization gears all provided hard-won lessons that informed subsequent designs. Engineers and commanders alike realized that speed, maneuverability, and robust structures were as vital as armament. These insights fed directly into the development of the Albatross fighters and, more broadly, the generation of biplanes that dominated the later war years. Culturally, the Eindecker secured the image of the fighter pilot as an elite figure. Its aces became symbols of national pride, while its very name inspired fear among opponents. The press, militaries, and the public began to view the skies as a theater of individual heroics as much as strategic necessity, a narrative that shaped how aviation was perceived for decades. Though few original examples survive today, preserved in museums or reconstructed as replicas, the Fokker Eindecker endures as a reminder of the moment when air combat became a decisive factor in modern war. Its historical weight is not in its longevity, but in its role as a catalyst, a relatively fragile monoplane that redefined combat in the air and forced every military power to adapt. The legacy of the Eindecker is thus twofold. It was both the first true fighter aircraft and the spark that ignited a global recognition of air power's importance. In the span of just a year, it demonstrated that wars would no longer be fought solely on the ground and at sea. From its synchronized gun to the tactical doctrines it inspired, the Eindecker laid the foundations for all fighter aircraft that followed. Its place in history is secure as the machine that changed air combat forever, setting in motion the evolution of aviation from fragile wood and fabric machines into the fast, powerful fighters that would dominate the skies of the 20th century.